Magnus Carlsen destroyed Dimitrios Mastrovasilis in a game they played recently in the World Blitz Championship 2021. So Magnus had white here, and we saw this open Sicilian on board, and black goes for this Taimanov variation. We had these standard opening moves, and now Magnus actually goes for an unusual move with pawn to g4. More common here is developing with bishop e2 or bishop e3. So Magnus is kind of playing in a Paul Keres style manner, throwing these pawns down in the way Paul Keres did back in the day. And we now had knight takes on d4, which I don't love from black because you centralise the black queen, and now it's difficult for black. You can't develop the bishop here like you'd want to do, or it stands in the way of the knight developing. If you bring the knight to f6, then e5 is very strong. And if you bring the knight to e7, well, it's just a little bit slow. I mean, white could continue developing like this. We have bishop e7, castles, castles, pawn to f4. I mean, look at this, a massive attack for white, and black is just a bit slow to the punch. So instead of all this, black goes for developing the queen side first with pawn to b5. Now we had bishop to e3, bishop b7, castles, rook c8. And now it's Magnus to play, and he could have made it very difficult for black to develop the king side here with pawn to g5. And the reason this move is so powerful is that if black plays bishop to c5, which is what happened in the game, now you can take on g7. And if black takes this bishop here, it's defended by the pawn, so you can recapture like this. And now the rook is hanging, and you can't play queen to f6 defending because obviously the pawn captures. But if we run it back to what was played in the game in this position here, Magnus played pawn to f3, which looks nice bolstering the centre, but now you allow black bishop to c5. And you can't take here in this variation, or you lose this one with check. The king comes to b1 and queen comes to f6 defending the rook. There's no pawn on g5. So this is the critical difference. So after black gets this bishop to c5 move, Magnus drops the queen back, we had this exchange, and black goes knight e7, so they've managed to solve those development problems. Now the queen re-centralises to d4, hitting this pawn, and you can't castle here as black, or you lose this pawn on d7, and it's not a pawn you can afford to give. So coming back here, that's why we had pawn to f6. Never play f6, as Ben Feingold says. It's just quite an ugly looking move. You open up to the king, whoops. But it was the best move in the position to defend g7. Now we had bishop e2 developing, queen c7 from black. Now we had king to b1, and here black misses a shot. So they could have played pawn to d5, a really excellent freeing move. The point being you can't take here, or after captures, we have takes on a2 with check. King b1, bishop takes back on d5, black is rock solid here, and they've got an attack going against the white king. So instead of this, after pawn to d5 here, white would have had to try something like queen to e3, stepping onto this e line and now threatening to make use of those pins to actually win material on d5. Black most likely would have followed up with pawn to b4, and now the saving grace for white here would have been pawn captures on d5, because if the knight's taken, which is best, then pawn to d6 comes, forking these two pieces. But black missed this shot to play pawn to d5 in this position here, and instead played knight to g6. Now it's a nice idea to come into this dark square, but after Magnus follows up with pawn to a4, undermining these ones, black just starts to play a bit slowly and a bit passively now, just responding to Magnus's threats. So we had bishop c6, the pawn captured here, the pawn recaptured, and now Magnus sits his queen on this dark square. Note that you don't want to capture this pawn immediately, because after takes, you're losing this pawn with check and there's a big attack coming. So coming back here, Magnus first plays queen b4, and now black really needed to try king to f7 here, just connecting these rooks, preparing to bring Ron across to the b file or the a file, and it's still a balanced game, even though Magnus, I would say, is slightly better. But coming back here, after queen b4, we had queen into e5, just missing the thread now, because this queen is really misplaced running into tactics on e5. And you also leave the c file where you had this battery against the c2 pawn, generating counterplay, because this now allows Magnus to take on b5 safely. Because if the bishop recaptures, the bishop can now recapture here. There's no threat against c2 anymore. And if you play rook b8 trying to take advantage of the pin, then pawn to c4 is good. And you're just bolstering that bishop, big advantage to white. But coming back here, after Magnus took on b5, black instead tried rook to b8, pinning that knight, but this set up a beautiful tactical combination. So we had knight d6 check. The king came to e7, which is the best move, and now the rook is attacking the white queen here, so you can't immediately take advantage of these discovered checks in a good way, and that's why we had bishop to b5, a nice interference move, blocking the attack of the rook. And now after the bishop recaptures here, which is the best move, knight c4 check comes, hitting the queen, the pawn blocks with d6, Magnus picks up here, and black actually resigned because the whole house is collapsing. If you recapture that knight, then d6 is falling with check. If you enjoyed this game, then do hit here to subscribe to the channel, and see another amazing epic chess game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.